welcome back once again to the Religious Studies Project. I'm David Robertson, and I'm here with...
Ray Redford.
Tell them where we are, Ray.
We are in a very, very smoky Newcastle, New South Wales, Australia. God. It's been one of those days. I've been up since 5:30.
You're doing well. There's flakes of ash coming down, which is exciting because you might actually have a white Christmas this year.
Hey, fingers crossed. I mean, fingers crossed that half the state stops burning, but maybe white Christmas might be nice.
It's not all plus, but there is positives. This week we have a podcast recorded by my good colleague Christopher Cotter, and he is speaking to Stacey Gutkowski about secular Jewish millennials in Israel and Palestine. So very timely and interesting. Take it away, Chris and Stacey.
In the popular imaginary, Israel-Palestine is, and has always been, a contested territory associated with sacred sites, the Abrahamic religions, religion-related conflicts, and a volatile political climate. However, this unnuanced stereotype takes little account of the lived realities on the ground, particularly among the constituency at focus in today's podcast. A large group of around 860,000 secular millennials who have come of age during a phase of national conflict when some Palestinian and Israeli government leaders, and not just fringe figures, have utilized religio-ethnic symbols to motivate and divide. Today, I am joined in Edinburgh by Dr Stacey Gutkowski to discuss what it means to be a secular Jewish Israeli millennial. What insights might the study of religion and secularity gain from taking a closer look at this constituency? Does it even make sense to refer to them as a constituency? And how do they relate to Judaism, to Israel, to Palestine, and hopefully much more? And Dr. Gutkowski is a senior lecturer in conflict studies and co-director of the Centre for the Study of Divided Societies at King's College London. She's the author of Secular War, Myths of Religion, Politics and Violence, published in 2013, and has been co-director of the Non-Religion and Secularity Research Network, where I know her from, since 2008. And today's interview touches on themes developed in her forthcoming book, Being Reasonable, ? Secular Selfhood and Israel's Post-Oslo Generation, which we published with Manchester University Press in 2020. So first off, Stacey, welcome to the Religious Studies Project.
Thanks, Chris. Really happy to be here. Thanks for inviting me.
Not at all. It's just wonderful that you're passing through Edinburgh. I couldn't not speak to you, really. So just first off, I know a bit about your research journey, but if you could just tell us a bit about your academic background, your interests, and how you have ended up conducting this study on secular Jewish Israeli millennials.
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Nowadays I describe myself more as a political sociologist. My academic background is in philosophy, peace studies, and international relations. And my main area of research has been broadly in the area of religion, conflict, and peace building. And specifically, I've been interested in the relationship between violence and the secular. My first book, which you introduced, took a Western case study looking at British foreign policy in Iraq and Afghanistan. And in the book, I introduced some theoretical questions that I thought I would then go on to explore over a series of, decades. And this was the next step kind of on that journey. Okay. And my particular interest in this book is to understand what it's like to be a person who's deeply embedded in religious tradition, but someone who distances themselves or claims to distance themselves from a religious tradition. What is it like to live through violence? And Jewish Israelis, young secular Jewish Israeli millennials, were an interesting case because they have lived through a sort of intensive period of war, since a series of wars since they've become young adults. But also it's a hard case because they're not secular in a Western sense. Mm-hmm. So it was really to provide myself with a hard case to try to push the theory further.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as regular listeners to the RSP probably know, in the study of secularity more broadly, I mean everything tends to be quite sort of Western European, North American, and everything. So the work in Israeli-Palestine context is really excellent. So hopefully this interview will really add to that. So you've already hinted a little bit at there. I mean, who are these secular Jewish Israeli millennials and why they are interesting? But maybe if you just tell us, you hinted at some of their life experiences and why they might be interesting. But if you could just tell us a bit about their sort of demographics and what makes them a group. I mean, millennials even might seem an obvious term to some, but if you can just get right down to the basics.
Of course. So I take the Pew definition of millennials, so born between 1980 and 1995. And then in terms of this population, not just millennials, but in the Israeli population overall, they're about 40% of the population. And there are fuzzy boundaries in the kinds of Jewish practices they engage in Israel between these Hilani, secular Jews, and Mesortim, the traditional Jews in Israel, because Jewish popular culture is pervasive. So unlike someone who identifies as maybe an agnostic or an atheist or secular in the UK, these are people who are more deeply embedded in tradition, and as Yaakov Yagar has argued, can't avoid it. As a group, they're largely urban and middle class. 66% are descended from European migrants, and 32% approximately are from Jews who are descendants of migrants from the Arab world and from the Middle East. That is this group. And interestingly, there are continuities between older generations, but there are some important distinctions as well.
Yeah, which we'll be hearing about now. This it seems to be an appropriate point to throw perhaps quite a difficult question at you. We opened up the interview to our listeners, and Louis Frankenthaler came in with, well, it's basically about the whole notion of, I guess, secular Jew. I mean, it's quite a common turn of phrase, yet we don't really seem to say secular Christians so much, or secular Muslims, secular Buddhists, and so on. So I'll just sort of run through it a little bit. He says that all too often people ask if you can be Jewish and not believe in a God, or God that is be an atheist Jew or a secular Jew. And he says that he thinks that this is a misdirected question, and wonders what your take on a more substantial query that asks, rather, can you be Jewish and not believe in a deity, but can you be Jewish and not do Judaism? That is, God is not really the issue, and many would claim that God does not care if a Jew believes in God, but only that you do what it is that this God supposedly claims Jews to do. So basically, not whether you can be, not whether a secular Jew is someone who doesn't believe in God, but do you still have to practice something to be considered a Jew, or is there something more inherent in that aspect?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and thank you very much to Louis for asking it. I mean, this is an essential question that's really preoccupying Jews in Israel and in the diaspora. I guess as a good social scientist, the first thing I would say is people can be whatever they want to be, and we take it seriously as analysts. So certainly you see in Israel and elsewhere people who reject strict or even partial observance of Jewish law, the halakha, who maybe claim they do it, but actually, engage in certain practices or something in between. And then you have scenarios, for example, in Israel with people who are migrants from the former Soviet Union who have become Orthodox Jews, but who are not considered as Jewish by the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel because they don't have a Jewish mother. They haven't had an Orthodox conversion. So it's a complicated picture. In terms of analytically, In Israel, it's a different case from the diaspora, because it is a context in which Judaism is woven into the fabric of public law and state life, and as Liebman says, as in popular culture, and also in Israel, it's a politicized identity. And Yadgar talks about how the early founders of the state couldn't find another way to sort of mark citizenship, Israeli citizenship, other than through Jewish religious identity and this particular way in which the Orthodox rabbinate decides who is Jewish, who is not. But then it creates, when we think about it practically in people's everyday lives, we can say, yes, people who are determined to be Jewish by the Orthodox rabbinate in Israel are embedded in Jewish popular culture. But so is everybody else who comes into Israel and ends up, observing or having the Shabbat as a weekend, because that's the weekend in Israel. But I think maybe what Lewis is asking about more is that, overlooks, no, it doesn't, not the question itself, but I think it's easy to overlook that while Judaism is the center of gravity for people in public life and private life in Israel, it's not the only source of existential culture, of philosophical ideas about life and its meaning. And that there are other things that people borrow from. Some of these are more, perhaps well known, such as Buddhism or New Age practices. But other things like Western philosophy are, I think, somewhat overlooked in the literature, as that these are all ways in which people make meaning in their lives, and some of those forms of meaning come from Judaism, and some of them come from other things. Now it's a different case for the diaspora, where Jewish identity, in contradistinction to other forms of identity, particularly Arab identity, is not enforced by the context, by the state context. And then again, I would, say, going back to the social science observation, that it matters what people do and how they identify. And
how they are identified again as well.
Yeah, exactly. And the terminology secular Jewish in English perhaps raises these analytical questions, but when we look at what people actually do, it's perhaps more clear.
Absolutely. And although I teed that up with things about, we don't really say secular Christian and that sort of thing, but thinking about, Abby Day and her work on the sort of not Christian nominalism and the sort of ethnic and familial aspects to that, thinking of my own Northern Irish context where everything is, so I'm from a Protestant background. Even if I converted to Catholicism, I would still be considered a Protestant. And that sort of thing, so there's all the, and yes, being a secular Catholic or a secular Protestant probably does make a lot of sense in a Northern Irish context in a way in which it mightn't make discursive sense in other places. Okay, so thanks for attempting that potential curveball there. So just jumping straight into the book, and so again, you've already hinted at some of your research questions, but what were you hoping to probe by engaging with this large constituency?
Well, there were two main research questions that animated the book that ended up working together and highlighting new things about each other and the way the question was set out as I went along. So I would say I had two working research questions, which were a starting point. And the first was, I guess, more empirical. As a young secular Jew, secular in, I suppose, scare quotes, what has it felt like coming of age during a phase of national conflict when some Palestinian and Israeli government leaders, not just sort of fringe figures, have used religio-ethnic symbols divisively. So looking at that phenomenologically, what is it like to be a person coming of age when religion has taken on new forms of mattering politically, even though it has been it has mattered politically since before the founding of the State of Israel, and then particularly after the 1967 war. So that was one question. And then the second set of questions, or the second question, as I said earlier, was to use Israel as a hard case to kind of think theoretically. And that question was, what do violent political conflicts look, and most importantly, feel like to people who claim to distance themselves from the majority religious tradition in their given context, and yet are fundamentally embedded within it?
And although we don't want to spend too much time on the methods, people will want to know how you went about it as well. But unless, the methods are really so exciting that you want to spend the rest of the interview talking about them, of course.
No. we can go through it quickly. So the project took a phenomenological approach. It's an interpretivist approach. I did 50 interviews with self-identified Haloni millennials. For people who know the case, the point about self-identified, I also took into account that some people appeared who, then began to speak about their religious practices and identities, and turned out to be Masorti some days and Haloni some days. So some days they're traditional, some days they're secular. So took that into account in the analysis and tried to take seriously what they say. Then I also did 20 interviews with the transitional generation who are just older than them. These are people who were in their early 20s in the 1990s. And then I interviewed millennials who are traditionally Jewish, who are Orthodox, and then members of civil society, some of whom are also millennial. There was a survey, over 90 millennials surveyed, in-depth survey. And then for triangulation, it was participant observation and field notes, public opinion polls, various public reports, testimonies, media review.
So not much then,
Yeah, no, it was a very, very quick project, as you can tell, yeah.
Excellent. So based on that large body of data and what we assume is your thorough analysis of it, let's just dive into some of your... what did you find?
Okay.
What's going on?
Just a few things. I guess maybe I'll talk a little bit first about what I found for this generation in terms of Hilonim as a religio class.
Okay.
Because I think of them as not as just a religious sector, but as an elite middle class group, which is also has this dimension of religious identity and practice. One of the things that's interesting about this group is that they came of age during what scholars have called the religionization of Jewish Israeli society. Now, scholars have defined this in different ways, and some talk about this as the religionization of politics, that orthodox and traditional views of, for example, the land and what the state of Israel should look like as the Jewish state, that these things have become more prominent over a secular socialist version of Zionism. And while that is the case, I'm also thinking in terms of what is called hadata, the sort of intensification of Jewish practice, that people would begin to maybe just practice a little bit more, do a little bit more marginally than they relatively would in terms of, for example, holiday celebrations with family. So this is something that they have come of age in the middle of. They've also come of age in the middle of sort of a revival of people thinking about what it is to be a secular Jew. of secular Jews becoming Orthodox, and of different forms of Judaism, conservative Judaism, Reform, revisionist Judaism, becoming marginally more popular with North American migration to Israel. So they come of age in the middle of this. But in terms of practice, in terms of identity, there are no sort of marked differences, as far as I could tell, with the transitional generation. In terms of practice, what's, I guess, interesting is that millennials don't see this as an intensification, right? Because they've come of age in the middle of it, so you don't see it. You don't see it because you're in it. So they think it's unremarkable. And people who are a bit older, talk about this massive shift in Jewish Israeli public life since the 1980s. There, in terms of the class aspect of this, what was quite noteworthy is the presence of Mizrahi middle class millennials who would identify with the term Haloni, and not simply because of this Zionist binary creation between, secular and religious Jews, but actually because the term means something to them, either in terms of politics or economics or class aspirations. So this class looks somewhat different than it did, because you have this group, you have new entrants, the migrants from the former Soviet Union, and these have changed sort of what the class looks like.
Obviously, I'm just sort of following your lead here, but this group is a major element in Israel-Palestine, is obviously Palestine and Palestinians. And so what about Israeli millennials and their relations, their constructions of Palestine and Palestinians and the whole conflict issue thing?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're not politically unique in that they stand out from the rest of the population. Their political opinions on the Palestinians and on occupation have, sort of followed the general trends along with the Jewish Israeli population. But there are two things that politically are distinctive in terms of their experience with Palestinians. One is separation policy following the end of the Second Intifada, with the building of the separation barrier in the West Bank and East Jerusalem. It's not as though previous generations of this group had necessarily lived in close contact with Palestinians. But scholars have found that this has had an impact socially and psychologically on being able to imagine the other. The other thing that's distinctive about this generation in terms of the Palestinians is the sheer number of wars and repeated wars. So for this group, the exceptions being the oldest and the youngest, but we can think of the core of this group of having served in the disengagement, withdrawing Israeli settlements from Gaza, then serving in 2006, 2008, 2011, 12, and 2014. Not to mention the 2006 war in Lebanon. So the sort of the level of violent contact is quite distinct. And then a couple of other things that are distinct have been the electoral success of center-right political parties, including religious parties, and then also debates between 2011 and 18 about the basic law, the constitutional arrangements of the State of Israel, and the ethnic framing of the state. So these are things that have while the religious experiences are somewhat different, the political experience is quite different from people who were in their 20s during the Oslo peace process, because this is the constituency that was the backbone of the peace movement, supportive of the Oslo process. So there's been a gradual shift politically to the center, relatively to the right, among this group. In the recent election, we see sort of, potentially another shift, at least in terms of political government leadership. So they're quite different from the transitional generation.
We're already at 25 minutes here, which is time running on. We can run on a little bit, of course, but we can. One of the main arguments in your book is this concept of, you call it neo-romanticism, as a sort of characterizing feature for the Halonis. So, what's going on there? What are you meaning by neo-romanticism?
Absolutely. I mean, this came out of, a grounded approach at needing to look at, okay, what was happening across quite a diverse group of people, interviewed, politically diverse from right to center to left, geographically diverse in terms of gender and other characteristics. And when I was looking at the material and trying to draw out, okay, what united this group, there were a couple of things that really united them. And one of them was this emphasis on personal experience. Now, certainly in the media and in public life, there's a lot of discussion that Jewish Israeli millennials are maybe a bit individualistic, selfish, that this is a product of the shift to a capitalist economy in Israel in the 1980s. And yeah, I saw that. But there seemed to be something going on as well about the idea of emotion and personal experience being very important. And that was something that people referred to repeatedly, about using their personal experience to navigate the world. And another feature that came out that was important was there was individualism, but then there was also a great deal of sort of attachment, not to the state per se as a political entity, but to Jewish people. And not, they reference this sort of Zionist discourse about the Jewish people, but for them it was specifically the Jewish people they know, their friends, their family. So this kind of dialectic between individual and collective. And then I needed to account for this political diversity. Why was it that the emotional ecology and the way people talked about themselves, talked about the conflict, the occupation, Palestinians, politics, life in general, why was there was a thread that underpinned all of that? Why? And so I started to think a bit more about Talal Assad's use of Stefan Collini's idea of romanticism and what Assad has to say about romanticism as a secular but also spiritual movement. Now, of course, romanticism was a feature of the European Jewish experience during the Haskalah. Litvak's book on this is very interesting. And also 19th century romanticism informed political Zionism. And I'm not saying that there's, I'm not trying to draw these direct historical connections. I'm more kind of inspired by Assad's use of this. And so I talk about that as the Halani habitus developed from the 19th century onwards, that it always had these kind of different strands to it. One romantic and one rationalist. And that this romantic strand is really important. And it's not obvious because when you speak to people, they will tell you that, they're heavily rationalist. And then you probe further and they're heavily emotional. And so I liked this idea of romanticism, and I called it neo-romanticism to set it apart, to say that I'm not drawing a clear line with the 19th century. To talk about this emphasis on personal experience, Collini says that for the 19th century Romantics, individual and collective didn't contradict one another. And he also says that 19th century Romanticism was neither explicitly politically conservative or progressive. It made possible different kinds of politics. And this, I thought, was a good way of talking about what's happening among this group. That lived experience is important, that there is something happening in terms of the role of emotion and also religious and spiritual and philosophical effervescence. These things are in motion in Israel, not just with New Ageism and secular renewal and the impact of Mizrahi Renaissance on popular culture, but there's something there. So these narratives about, being reasonable and being rationalist need to be unpicked. And I thought it accounted for this sort of tension between the individual and the collective. And what I say is neo-romanticism is a kind of neo-republican citizenship. So what's talked about in the literature and in the Jewish Israeli media is that liberalism and republicanism, Zionist republicanism, care for the state is somehow juxtaposed. I'm like, no, these things are working together. That this group, there may be, absolutely, there are people who are very, very liberal and individualistic and leave the state, but it would be a mistake to miss the ways in which they are sort of bound to the state as well.
So I'm going to ask you two more questions. One is going to be why does this matter? So this, you've just painted there this sort of neo-romantic thread that's uniting this seemingly potentially disparate group, but I think in the book you draw out some of the implications of this sort of politically, and then I'm also interested in maybe why should we care about it? So in religious studies, what difference does it make to me?
Okay, two very, very big questions. Let me start with the first one. Why does it matter politically? There are a lot of reasons why the state of the political situation between Palestinians and Jewish Israelis is what it is at the moment, having to do with violence, with the election of particular leaders on both sides. By strategic decisions made not to continue with negotiations after 2014. And what I'm saying is that in the context of what critical geographers call the national atmosphere, that it's also important to look at what's happening in terms of lived habitus and how people think about themselves. And what I found was that people, regardless of where they were on the political spectrum, were united in thinking of themselves as what I call fulcrum citizens, balancing out extremes, both extremes on the right, extremes on the left, Jewish Israeli extremes, Palestinian extremes, what they see as extremist internationally in Europe, that they see themselves as balancing people, and that they see this related to their Helleniness, their religio-class habitus, but that they're also shaped by their, for this generation, a Jewish-centric experience after the failure of Oslo. So I say that this is part of the mix in understanding the ongoing conflict and continuing occupation. It's one of many different factors, but I don't think it's yet been particularly brought to the fore. So that's what I want to say about that.
Excellent. And how about for someone not in the study of Israel-Palestine, perhaps not even in the study of the secular and that sort of thing? I mean, what do you think is the sort of import of that?
The big takeaway for religious studies. When I got to the end of the book and I revisited these questions, the one thing that stood out for me was the importance of studying the individual level and of studying gradations of emotional attachment to religious identities, symbols, spaces. In Brubaker's work in 2015, he points to this about the importance of studying the individual level, and but I don't think that we yet in the fields are particularly good at doing that, and yet we claim to study ethno-religious conflict or religio-ethnic conflict and the intersection of the two. And it's not simply, insert identity and everyone's going to feel the same way. And we know that that's kind of a something we know practically. But I thought that this was an area that could be further advanced. And I talk about it a bit at the end of the book about where I think we could go, and particularly thinking about studying political conflict with an ethno-religious dimension beyond identity. So that was one thing I wanted to do in the book was there's a chapter on space and there's a chapter on epistemology, and to try to move into new directions.
Excellent. Begging the forgiveness of Helen, who'll be transcribing this, I did say if we had time, I'd mention another theme, which is like sacred space, and how that came up in the book. So if you can maybe, what would you have wanted to say in 30 seconds that you haven't got to say?
No, that's okay. It attaches to the other thing.
Yeah.
I mean, again, this is related to the point about the literature, I think, needs to not presume emotional attachment to sacred space, and that needs to drill down into people's individual feelings about a sacred space. Because just because people have a ethno-religious identity, they may not particularly care about that place. But at the same time, just because they claim they don't care, does not mean that they actually do not.
Exactly, yeah.
And so it makes ideas around compromising and sharing sacred space complicated. And I looked at the Haram al-Sharif Temple Mount and attitudes to that in the book.
Fantastic. Yes, so listeners, if you want to find out more about that, when in 2020 are we expecting this, or do we not want to say a month yet?
Hopefully soon.
Hopefully soon. So that book is going to be Being Reasonable, ? Secular Selfhood and Israel's Post-Oslo Generation. Stacey Gutkowski, we hope our listeners will read that book and shout widely about it, but if they don't, they've heard an excellent interview today, and thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Fascinating podcast about an issue I don't know an awful lot about, but is obviously very timely and important. Global issue right now. Shall we talk a little bit about the conference that we're at just now?
We should. We are at the AASR, the Australian Academy for the Study of Religions. It's my second. I don't know why I didn't come last year. Oh yeah, because I was in your neck of the woods last year.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah. It's day one, or day two technically. We had a HDR day yesterday for the PhD students, and a couple of keynote lectures. I think Naomi Goldenberg gave one.
She gave a keynote this morning. Yesterday was a workshop.
That's the term.
On introducing kind of critical methodologies.
And the weather is holding up. It's not raining, but as we mentioned earlier, it's smoky. So very smoky.
It's a great pleasure for me to be here because we've had so many Australian contributors and editors to the RSP over the year. Yourself and Bree at the moment, of course, but and Venetia Robertson.
I think, with you being here is now the highest contingent of RSP contributors in one place. If Bree was here, it'd be even higher. I think.
It would be, yeah.
Because Tara and Ben, who I did the podcast with, are upstairs.
Oh, that's right.
Yeah, Venetia, Carol, yourself, me.
Yeah, Carol Cusack, who's one of our board members, in fact, of the Religious Studies Project, the charity that that runs the thing. So yeah, very exciting. I don't know if Brianne's maybe recording tomorrow, but we'll certainly have some podcasts coming out of the conference, even if we don't record them at the conference itself. But that's for next year. We've got 2 more podcasts this year, and Ray and I are recording these intros just now. Next week is Applied Religious Studies at Georgia State University. That's Dave McConaughey talking to Molly Barrett about their program at Georgia State University, and the way that they are trying to innovate and professionalize religious studies degree programs. You're going to hear quite a lot about these kind of issues coming up in the RSP in the next year or two, as it's something that Dave's very interested in, but it's also something that's vitally important to the discipline in establishing ourselves as something that's kind of worthwhile for people to do.
Yeah. It's actually something I'm quite excited to hear, mainly because it's the sort of thing that I really would like undergrads to hear, to give them the credence that this is definitely a worthwhile endeavor, not just in Australia but around the world.
And applicable more broadly than just having theological conversations or something. That this is something which is more broadly applicable in professional contexts. Talking of professional context, this is very much an unprofessional context. We're sitting in a room and improvising our way through these intros. So maybe it's time that we get out before we embarrass ourselves.
Someone walks in and goes, "Are you two talking to yourselves?"
Yes. Are you supposed to be here? So what we'll do is we'll just say thanks for listening. The Religious Studies Project is sponsored by the British Association for the Study of Religions, the North American Association for the Study of Religion, and the International Association for the History of Religions. The Religious Studies Project is produced by the Religious Studies Project Association, SCIO, a Scottish charitable incorporated organisation, charity number SC047750.
Brought to you by editors Brianne Fallon and David McConaughey, and founding editors Chris Cotter, that's me, and David Robertson, that's him. Our features are edited by Rebecca Barrett-Fox, with marketing managed by Benjamin Marcus. Our Opportunities Digest managed by Ella Buck, podcast transcription by Helen Bradstock, and social media managed by Ray Radford. Don't forget, you can support the project by using our amazon.com.co.uk and .ca links, or donating at patreon.com/projectrs. And you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, YouTube, iTunes, and other portals. Thanks for listening.